days of old, when dining was done in grand halls like this one, the carving of meat for the dining table was considered a gracious art, one in most cases performed solely by high-ranking officials or even royalty. Elaborate rules governed how a joint of meat or a carcass of fowl should be treated at the table, which cuts could be touched by the hand and which could not, how a cut should be presented on the plate. The art of skillful carving was looked upon as so essential by some of our ancestors that it was taught to well-born young men as an indispensable part of a good education. Indeed, the last tutor provided a young nobleman in Edwardian times was a master of carving. The art of découpage, as carving is known in France, was customarily performed with great flair and showmanship by a gentleman of good lineage, usually a nobleman. In the home, the carving and serving of meat was carried out by the head of the household, who regarded it as a matter of honor to be able to carve skillfully. Over the years, the carving of meat has gone from center stage here at the dining room table, unfortunately, backstage to the kitchen, with the possible exception of the Thanksgiving turkey. That's where it's usually performed. No longer is it an art performed with great skill and certain flair. Even in France, the custom today is service à la Russe. The art of carving may never attain its former glory, but then few of us dine these days in rooms like this one. But with the growing interest in good food and dining in this country, there is a renewed interest in food presentation, and carving is a basic part of that. We hope that this video will make some contribution to a renaissance in the art of carving. We have divided this video into 5 separate segments. The first is the tools of the carver's art. How to select them for the carving task at hand, how to get them sharp, and how to keep them sharp. The second segment is how to carve beef. We start with an elegant standing rib roast and then move on to the London broil, porterhouse, pot roast, brisket, and conclude the segment with the elegant chateaubriand. The third segment is how to carve lamb. In the lamb segment, we learn how to carve the leg, the saddle, the rack, and the crown roast of lamb. The fourth segment is how to carve pork. We discuss carving pork from country ham to fresh ham to pork loin and finally tavern ham. In the fifth segment, we talk about how to carve fowl. You will discover that there is more than one way to carve fowl, with chicken, duck, pheasant, game hens, and finally, the holiday turkey. So now let's begin mastering the art of carving. The tools of the carver's art have changed very little since man first approached joint of meat, knife in hand, with the intent of graceful dissection. The basic tool then and now was and is a good sharp knife. There have developed over the years a variety of knives from which to choose, depending upon the carving task at hand. There are also some additional accoutrements necessary, or at least nice to have to make the job easier. Let's examine then the tools of the carver's art. First is the carving set. Now, most of you, or certainly many of you, have received as a wedding gift or an anniversary gift, and you probably have it kicking around in a drawer someplace, a carving set. They are often very, very elegant with bone or stag horn handles and etched blades. They sometimes come with a steel to keep it sharp. They usually come with a fork and a knife, sometimes 2 or 3 knives, and they're elegant. There really are a lot of different knives to choose from. We thought we would look at a few here that I think are basic to the art of carving. First, you need a good French chef's knife or cook's knife. Now, this is a big knife, but it's really, once you get to using one, you'll find that it's one of the most practical tools for cutting all kinds of things and for carving as well. Another one that's important to have if you do any roast beef carving or lox, sliced salmon, things that you want cut very, very thin, is what they call a roast beef slicer. Here again, they come in a variety of different styles of blade and handle. This is a blade that has a unique grind. It's ground in little gouges on one side, and then on the other side, it's ground in between the gouges on the other side. So it makes for a very, very thin blade, which is very good for slicing things very thin. This is a roast slicer that is a forged knife. You can see the difference. This has a little elbow here. What do they call it? Shoulder. Actually, this is made out of a solid piece of steel that is stamped and pounded, much like the blacksmith would do. He'd heat it in the forge and then pound it. They are a more expensive knife than the flat stamped knife, and yet when it comes to a good sharp knife, as long as the steel is good, either one will work equally well. It's important if you have a stamped knife. Now, forged knives, usually they're what they call full tang. That means that the steel goes all the way through. That's important even in the flat knives or the stamped knives. You want that steel to go all the way through and be held there by 3 good solid rivets. Just a good indication of the quality of the knife is a full tang. So a roasting knife, or a roast slicer, I should say. A boning knife is another important tool for carving, as well as doing all kinds of cutting up in the kitchen. They come in a variety, again, of different handles and blade sizes. The size of the blade is usually either 4, 5, 6, or 7 inches. You have those choices. I prefer the 5 or 6 inch blade, but there again, it's personal preference. Many people prefer a stiff blade, but if you're going to do some very thin fish slicing or something, you might want a more flexible blade. Again, personal preference. A carving fork of some sort is essential to carving. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. In fact, many people prefer, and many carvers use, nothing but the table fork for carving. They do come in a variety of different styles here. Don't be misled with these long tines here into thinking that's designed to embed deeply into the meat. It's not. It's really more designed just to hold it. You don't have to pierce the meat with it in order to do some carving. So there you have some of the basic tools of the trade. More important than the type of knife that you use, more important than the type of steel from which it is made, more important than the surface upon which you use it or how carefully it's stored, more important than any other single factor in mastering the art of carving is the sharpness of the blade itself. It is far easier, and with a little bit of showmanship, far more graceful to carve any meat with a sharp sword, a machete even, than a blade that is dull. Now, there are 3 basic steps involved in getting a knife sharp and keeping it that way: grinding, honing, and steeling. Until recently, I would not have recommended that anyone try to grind a knife at home. That was a job best left in the hands of experts with the proper equipment and the know-how. My grandfather, God rest him, loved to grind knives and axes on a big sandstone wheel that sat out by the shed. He did a pretty good job on things like axes and hoes, but when it came to grandmother's knives, that sandstone didn't sharpen them, it ate them. Grandfather could turn a knife like that into a knife like that in no time at all. Even today's electric grinding wheels require special skill and knowledge to use. They too can eat knives if you don't know at least as much about using them as a professional knife maker. There is equipment available now that makes it not only possible, but really quite easy to grind a knife at home, and we'll discuss that a little bit later on. But without that special equipment and know-how, you are best off, when a good knife needs sharpening, to take it to a professional. A good knife seldom does need regrinding. It comes from the factory pre-ground, and unless you let the kids dig in the dirt with it, or let it bounce around in that drawer we were talking about, or let it get extremely dull from lack of proper care, it should seldom need grinding. Now, honing is a second step, and for honing you need some sort of carborundum stone. There are a variety of different kinds. This is the one that we used to use at the market. It's kind of messy. It's an oil stone with 3 sides, fine, medium, and coarse. And you put oil in the bottom of the well there, and it just sort of bathes in oil. And then you ran the knife across that. You buy the same kind of a thing at the hardware stores. It's a little carborundum stone. They usually come with a coarse side and a fine side, and they too require oil. In fact, they're often called oil stones. And you've got a little can of oil comes with them, and you squirt the oil on, and then sharpen your knife with it. I'll show you how to do that in a minute. This is a diamond whetstone. It's essentially the same principle, but it's just a hunk of plastic with nickel laminated on it, and embedded in the nickel are diamond particles. You use all 3 of those hones exactly the same way. You just lay the knife down. First, it has to have some oil on it. Lay the knife down on the stone, tilt it up just far enough to make contact with the edge, with the bevel here. Some knives have a double bevel, like this big one here, where the grind is flat down to a point and then a second bevel on it. So it takes a little bit of know-how to find the right bevel. So once you get the bevel, then it's back and forth in an orbiting fashion, first on one side of the knife and then on the other, until you get a good edge on the thing. They're There are a variety of different kinds. There's these with the carborundum stones. You can also get Arkansas stone. They all work the same way, and they're all kind of messy, but they eventually will do the job if you know how to use them and practice learning how to use them. Now, the third step the final step is steeling. This is a butcher's steel. Now, this does not get the knife sharp. It only helps keep it sharp. You can't get a dull knife sharp with a steel. And these two require a little special knack in using. At the market, we do it like this. It becomes sort of second nature, but the principle is to keep a 20-degree angle or a 25-degree angle just exactly. It becomes sort of second nature after a while, but it does take a little bit of practice. The trick is to keep your elbows equidistant, one from the other, and don't start flopping things around here or something will get cut off. Now, if you don't want to do it this way, you can do it this way. It's a little safer, a little slower, but a little safer. And you can put it down on the thing, on the cutting board, and cut down this way. Again, being very careful to keep the angle just right. So, those are the three steps in sharpening a knife. And keeping it sharp: grinding, honing, and steeling. And now let me show you a new piece of kitchen equipment that does all three almost automatically. The Chef's Choice Diamond Hone Sharpener has revolutionized knife sharpening. With the Chef's Choice, there's no excuse for a dull knife. All the messy equipment, the critical angles, and the professional expertise required in the past are a thing of the past. The Chef's Choice does it all. All three steps: grinding, honing, and steeling. The folks at Edgecraft call them pre-sharpening, sharpening, and honing, but the result is a razor-sharp edge nonetheless. And it's effortless. Here's how it works. This is the pre-sharpener. Inside here are little discs of nickels impregnated and studded with diamonds, and all you have to do is just pull those through. Now, the magnets hold the blade in exactly the right spot so that it puts just the perfect bevel on so that you can go on to the next two steps. Now, this is a grinder, so you don't want to use that very often. You don't need to use that very often. Only once, when the knife really gets dull and needs to go back to the pre-sharpening stage. This is the sharpening stage. Now, inside of here is an orbiting diamond-studded plate, very like the hones that we showed you earlier. Only in this case, the plates are orbiting, and again, all you have to do is pull the knife through gently. The machine actually wants to do it for you. And this you can use as often as you need to keep a good sharp edge on the knife. Now, the final step is the hone, and that's very like the steel. It's just very, very fine diamond dust on the interior of the plate, and that just touches up the edge and keeps it polished so that you have a razor sharp edge every time and without any effort at all. With the Chef's Choice, there is just no excuse for a dull knife. So, armed with a good sharp knife and a few basic tools of the trade, let's begin mastering the art of carving. Few cuts of meat that appear on today's table can match the grandeur and the elegance of a standing rib roast. It is our most magnificent gastronomic link to an elegant and noble past. And like several of the cuts of meat that we will be discussing on this video, the successful carving of a prime rib of beef begins at the butcher shop when you make your selection. Here are a few things that you should be aware of when selecting the rib roast, and a few tips on what you should ask the butcher to do to a rib roast so that your carving task can be made a whole lot simpler. First, for the most wonderful of rib roasts, make sure that you buy prime aged beef. Now, prime beef is a little hard to find, but make sure that at least it has a little bit of age on it. Now, that dark outside exterior on the beef roast is what lets you know that the beef has been well aged, so look for that. It is a real indication of quality. Nothing makes a good prime rib better than aged beef. The second thing is an absolute must. Have the butcher remove the chine bone, and that means totally. Make sure that all of that center chine bone of the beef, where the carcass was split in half, that must be gone, or there is no way that you can get your carving knife through the meat without terrible trouble. So make sure the chine bone is removed. It's also a good idea to make an elegant-looking roast to have the lifter meat removed. Now, the lifter meat is that muscle on top of the main tender rib eye section of the prime rib. Not quite as tender, and it also has, there's a fat layer between it. So it's a good idea if the butcher will do it, even if you have to pay for it. Take it home and use it for ground beef or something, but have the lifter meat removed. Third, if you want a smaller than whole rib, the whole standing rib or prime rib is usually 7 ribs. If you want a smaller one, make sure that the butcher gives you the small end. The small end of the prime rib are the ones that come off right next to the short loin, or the most tender part of the beef animal. There are 2 methods of carving a prime rib of beef, and we will discuss both. First, the classic English method, and then the somewhat more casual but just as effective and perhaps easier French method. First, the English method. To carve in the classic English manner, of course, a silver tray is nice, not necessary, but nice. Set the roast down on the large end, so the small and most tender end is up. Anchor the fork, just you don't have to bury the fork into the meat, just anchor it enough so that you can hold it steady. And with your carving knife, slice as thick or as thin as you like through the meat till you hit the bone. Now when you hit the bone, then cut along the edge of the bone down through the meat so that you can lift off one slice at a time. That goes off onto your side platter there. Now the next rib, you have room to go between the ribs, so you can go all the way through. And this particular one, if you like, some people like to chew on the bone, and if you don't like that, then you can cut through and take the ribeye off and set the bone aside separately. This piece gets taken off. Set that aside, and you can keep on going until you have the number of slices that you need. Down to the bone, around the bone, and set aside the slice. That is the classic English method. Now, for the more casual method, it is necessary to have a wooden carving board, or what are called a trencher. I have one of these here, and also it's. You need a napkin because you do not use a carving fork in this method. Rather, you just hold on to the bone like that and cut down just against the cutting board. Cut down through the meat down to the cutting board and lift off the... butcher did not quite get through, did he? There's the French method. You can cut one slice with the bone and one slice without it. You can cut it as thick or as thin as you like. And that's the French method. Whichever way you carve it, the prime rib is the noble prince of beef cuts. But there are a few others. The art of carving is not practiced exclusively at the dining room table or at an elegant buffet. It is equally important to the enjoyment of any meat served anywhere. A flank steak grilled on the coals will be far more tender and juicy if it's properly carved. The classic cut of meat called for London broil is a flank steak. Although you're apt to see all kinds of cuts in the meat market, this is a top round, which is also often called London broil, but the carving principle is the same. But with the traditional classic flank steak, it's even more important. The flank steak has a very pronounced grain that goes in one direction, and it's a very tough cut of meat if not properly carved. If you cut it with the grain, you're going to have something remotely resembling beef jerky rather than a London broil. The proper way to carve a London broil is with a nice long knife, because you want it cut very thin, and you have to cut it across the grain, but at an angle. If you cut it across the grain this way, you're going to have just little teeny pieces of meat. But if you start with the first cut at an angle, almost parallel to the cutting board, then the slices become nice and big as you get farther into the flank steak. Nice, big, and absolutely delicious. The simplest recipe in the world. Salt and pepper and just a couple of minutes on each side, either in the broiler or on the barbecue grill, and you have London broil, the most delicious and simple of dishes. There's a saying among us steak lovers that you should never cut a good steak thin. It would be a shame to cut a beautiful porterhouse like that any less than an inch thick. And yet most of us these days don't eat quite that much red meat. So what do you do with a steak like that? You don't serve the whole steak to one person. That's too much. You carve it. And there's a special way you should carve a beautiful porterhouse like this. It's a porterhouse or a T-bone, or really for that matter a sirloin steak, with the bone in. Take the bone out. First just cut down along the T-bone to loosen the fillet. Actually, you just sort of take the whole T-bone section out. Now save that for, that's around our house, that's Daddy's part. They get to chew on the bone. That's the best part of the steak. Then carve each piece, the top loin and the tenderloin, into pieces. You don't have to worry about cutting these thin because the tenderloin and the top loin of the porterhouse steak are very, very tender cuts of meat. And you can cut them into chunks, really, and then serve your guests a little bit of each. A small piece of the tenderloin and a small piece of the top loin. Once you have it carved, you can transfer it to a platter to take to the table. And there, serve your guests a little bit of the tenderloin and a little bit of the top loin on each platter so that everyone gets a little bit of the most tender part and a little bit of the most flavorful part all on one plate. Perhaps a little vinaigrette asparagus to go with that. Loaf of crusty French bread and a glass of wine. You have a meal fit for a king. There are a couple of cuts of beef that are almost always carved in the kitchen. A beef chuck pot roast is one. All too often this dish is not even carved, rather just pulled apart, with each diner receiving a hunk of tenderness of the meat itself. A pot roast, or rather a chuck pot roast, is a combination of several muscles. There are several muscles that come together in the chuck, and each one needs to be carved in a little bit different manner. So what you should do is take the cut and separate those individual muscles. On a well-done pot roast such as this, it's very easy to do. It falls apart. Now, if rather than give a diner a whole hunk of meat like that, where their tendency is to cut it this way with the grain, which makes a stringy, very stringy, tough, sometimes tender, not at all tender cut of meat. If you will take the pieces and turn them so that each piece can be carved into slices across the grain. And we've talked about carving across the grain many times. It's important to cut so that you shorten the fibers and cut across the grain will do that. So cut each individual muscle across the grain. I'll never forget the time my daughter, when she was about 4, was complaining because a piece of meat was tough. It was a pot roast such as this, and I just turned the piece and cut it across the grain, and her comment was, the meat, it's the same meat, but it's easier to eat. So carving across the grain makes a pot roast much easier to eat. And when you have it all nicely carved, spoon over a bit of the gravy, and you can take it to the table not only looking quite nice, but considerably more tender than if you had just hunked it. The brisket of beef is one of the most versatile that the beef animal has to offer. On the plains of Texas, it's the cut used for Texas-style barbecue, cooked long and slow over mesquite charcoal. In New England, it's simmered to make the traditional New England dinner. And some people only know the cut as corned beef. The brisket is often used to make corned beef. No matter how it's cooked, whether it's corned or roasted or braised or barbecued, the beef brisket is one for which carving is critical. Done properly, the meat is as tender as it can possibly be, as tender as the juiciest steak. Done wrong, and you have a lot of chewing to do. The brisket, like so many other cuts that we've talked about, must be carved across the grain. It's basically a tough cut of meat. It also helps if you carve it as thin as possible. If it's a boiled dinner, you can carve it thick, but it'll be so much easier to eat and so much more tasty if you cut it very thinly. So, in order to do that, a nice long carving knife is essential. The long blade, it doesn't have to be this particular shape. It can be one of the rounded blades, but a good long one is nice. A fork of some kind that you don't have to stick into the meat, but something long here that you can hold it down so that it doesn't wiggle around. And then carve on the bias. Now, the reason for that is that it gives you nice big slices. With the first couple of slices will be somewhat smaller, but as you get into the cut, you're cutting across the grain, and the slices get bigger. It's very like carving a London broil or a flank steak. Just sliced thin, and gradually you have nice, even, and thick, wide, I should say, not thick. You want them thin, but wide, so they don't look skimpy. The long blade helps you make nice, even slices. So there you have it, beautiful big slices of braised brisket. For an elegant small dinner party, nothing beats a tenderloin of beef. In France, that's called a chateaubriand. Now, I know that in this country, you find all different cuts labeled chateaubriand, but in reality, in French, the chateaubriand is just the portion of the tenderloin that comes off right at where the porterhouse is when it's boned out. This is a true French-style chateaubriand, and it's the simplest thing in the world to carve. And because the filet or the chateaubriand is extremely tender, it's the most tender part of the beef, you really can slice it nice and thick like a steak. It's not really necessary to slice it paper thin. In fact, you want it to be good and thick so you can enjoy a good, tasty piece of beef. So just slice off slices and rearrange them on the carving platter, or on the serving platter, I should say. That's nice and pink. You can slice it really as thick or as thin as you choose. Chateaubriand is traditionally served with a chateau sauce and chateau potatoes, specialty of the particular chateau in France. The tender and elegant chateaubriand. And with that, we have begun to master the art of carving. In this segment on lamb, we'll be showing you how to carve a leg of lamb, a saddle of lamb, a rack of lamb, and a crown roast of lamb. We'll start with the leg of lamb, which is probably the one that most people carve, the one that most people have most often. Racks of lamb and saddles of lamb seem somehow to be restaurant fare, but many of us have a leg of lamb at home. You know, a leg of lamb is one of those cuts of meat that can be made so much easier to carve if you know how to ask the butcher to prepare it at the market. If you'll ask him to take the H-bone out. Now, the H-bone is the hip bone of the animal, and it is so much easier to carve a leg if you have the butcher remove that while the leg is fresh. That leaves you only the long leg bone that makes it possible to make nice, long, thin slices, and you don't have to try and carve around the bone. So ask the butcher to remove the H-bone. It makes it so much easier to carve. There are two basic ways of carving a leg of lamb, and I'll tell you about one, but we're going to do it the second way. In many, many cookbooks that have a section on carving, they will tell you to take a piece of the cushion off the bottom of the leg so that you can set it up so that you can then carve down across the grain of the meat. That I find a bit awkward, and it's totally unnecessary. It's much, much easier to do it the French way. Now, the French way of carving a leg of lamb is one to have the bone exposed here so that you can put a little piece of one of these little booties on. These things came into being long after the fork, but for a long, long time the fork was not appropriate at the dining table. So these little panties that you see on chops and things had their origin, I think, back in Elizabethan times. The French method of carving a leg of lamb is the one that we're going to talk about here. And because lamb is so tender from one end to the other, you don't have to worry too much about carving across the grain or with the grain or whatever. You can just do it in nice long slices. Hold the lamb by the leg here and take off a few slices in this direction. Transfer those to your plate. See how easily it just slices off? A good sharp knife makes it absolutely the simplest thing in the world. And you get nice, long, even, uniform slices. When the slices begin to get a little too big, simply turn the leg and start carving in another direction. Like so. A few slices of nicely carved lamb, a rice pilaf, and a vegetable, and you have a marvelous meal. One of the most complicated cuts of lamb to carve is the saddle of lamb, but it's worth learning how to do because it is absolutely the most tender, delicious cut of lamb you can imagine. To carve it, set it on a trencher or a carving board. Let's move this over a little closer here. Now, there are three different component parts. The saddle of lamb is the equivalent of the T-bone porterhouse of the beef. It has a little tenderloin on the underside, top loin, and a little bit of the tail of the T-bone here. So the first thing we'll do is turn it over and take off these little flanks. We'll set those aside. Those are the least tender portions of the lamb. And now we'll take off the tenderloin. To do that, just cut down against the bone and scoop it out. Scoop out the little slice of tenderloin. We'll set those aside. Do the same on the other side. Now we can turn the saddle back over, and we can carve down through. Just here again, it's so tender we don't have to worry about carving with the grain or against the grain. Any way will do here. Just take a few slices off this side, and then do exactly the same thing on the other side. Steady the knife. Down to the bone. Slide your knife along the bone. Now, when you serve it, arrange the slices nicely back on the platter, and then the little tenderloin pieces can be carved in little dollops. This is the filet mignon of the saddle of lamb. So carve those into little dollops so that each of your guests can have a bit of each. A little bit of the top loin muscle, a little of the tenderloin muscle. Arrange those on top. Saddle of lamb. An absolutely delicious cut of lamb when properly carved. The rack of lamb and the crown roast of lamb are two of the simplest cuts of lamb in the world to carve if they are properly prepared for carving by the butcher. I don't know how many times I have seen racks absolutely destroyed by the way the butcher cracks the chine. Now, the chine bone is the middle of the carcass of lamb. It's the backbone of the animal, and when the animal is split in half, that chine bone, it forms just a wall of bone that you have to get through. And all too often, the butcher will just zip through the chine bone on the saw, sort of making random thicknesses of chops in between the ribs. And then you're forced to cut in between the bones where he has already started, and you have no control over how thick or how thin the rack of lamb is. The best way, the only way, to have the butcher prepare a rack for you is to have him totally remove the chine bone. To do this, he has to cut the chine bone off completely so that you have nothing on the back of that rack but meat. And that way, when you get here to the dining room table, all you have to do is just set the rack cooked nicely on the carving board, and then cut down through between the ribs, and you can cut them as thick or as thin as you like. If you like, you can cut double thick racks with 2 rib bones. Or you can cut very thin chops by cutting up against the side of one so that you have very, very thin chop, and then you cut up against the side of the next one, and you have a chop that contains no bone at all. And then you get another thin chop. So you have all kinds of variations if you make sure that chine bone is not cracked through on the saw the way it so often is, but rather removed the way it ought to be. Now, the crown roast of lamb is carved exactly the same way. That is, down through between each rib. You don't even have to hold it. Because it's all formed together, it holds itself. So all you have to do is cut down between the ribs and serve it exactly the same way. A tip on cooking a crown roast: do not cook a crown roast of lamb with the dressing inside. It's much, much better and cooks much more evenly if you just take a wad of aluminum foil, put that in the lamb while it's cooking, and then if you want to serve it with a pilav or a rice stuffing inside, put the stuffing in after the lamb is cooked. Rack of lamb, the simplest cut of lamb to carve if the butcher cuts it right. In this segment on pork, we'll be discussing how to carve a variety of different cuts: the loin of pork, the fresh leg of pork, and a couple of different kinds of ham. Of all the cuts of pork in the meat case, I think ham is probably the most confusing because there are a variety of different kinds. There's boneless ham, and there's ready-to-eat ham, and there's tavern hams, all kinds of hams. There are even hams that aren't hams at all, not in the traditional sense. In the traditional sense, the ham was a cured hind leg of a pig. This is the traditional country ham. Now, there's a traditional way to carve a country ham, so I thought we would start there. Country hams are traditionally served not usually as a big dinner, but as a buffet item with beaten biscuits and perhaps honey and a little mustard. They're something that you as an hors d'oeuvre, really, particularly the Smithfield ham. Carving one is really Quite simple. It's just if you follow a procedure, and it's important to slice it very, very thin, so you need a nice, long, thin-bladed knife. First, make a cut at the hock here, straight down, until you hit the bone. And then at an angle, make a cut to take out this wedge. Now that is usually a goodly portion of fat anyway, so just set that aside. Oh, that's beautiful country ham. And then start slicing, just thin slices, all the way down to the bone. These are equally good served on melon, like you would serve a prosciutto, an Italian country ham. And there is no such thing as too thin a slice when you're carving a country ham. And the best part is what's left after you've carved the ham, because that ham bone goes wonderfully well with red beans and rice. Country ham, the granddaddy of all hams. There are a couple of different ways to carve a loin of pork, because there are a couple of different kinds of loins of pork. The pork loin is the back of the pig, and it runs from the shoulder clear back to the ham. And there are two different kinds of pork loins. One is the portion that contains the rib, and the other one is the loin portion that contains a part of the tenderloin. We're going to show you how to carve both. First, when you buy a pork loin rib section, it's important, as it is with so many all other rib sections, that you have the chine bone removed. So ask the butcher to remove the chine bone, and then you can carve it much more simply. Here is a rib section from the loin of pork that we just saw cut in half here. And to carve it, once the chine bone is removed, is a simple task. Just hold it firm with the fork, and then cut down between the rib bones so that you can take off nice pork chop sizes here. There's one, two, as many as you want. Now again, if you want thinner ones, you can cut on one thin one on one side of the rib bone, and then cut a small one with the rib bone in it, and then you can cut another thin one without the rib bone. So once that chine bone is removed, you have all kinds of flexibility as to how you carve your rib section from the loin of pork. There are a couple of nice pork chops. Now, let's set this aside and go on to the loin section here, which is a totally different ballgame. This one has the chine bone and the backbone as well, but like the loin or the saddle of lamb, you want to take that tenderloin out. So turn it and take this. Just scoop out that whole tenderloin section and set that aside to be carved into individual little dollar-shaped pieces. Take the top loin portion by just cutting down to the bone and then along the bone so that you can set the bone aside here, and then you can carve these into nice individual sizes. You have nothing now to worry about, no bone at all, just thin slices or thick slices of the pork top loin. And you might want to serve each of your guests a bit of the top loin with just a little slice or two of that very, very tender tenderloin. Serve that with a little red cabbage and perhaps a slice of broiled apple, and you have an absolutely delicious pork loin roast. A fresh leg of pork is not traditional Sunday dinner anymore these days, like it used to be back in the days when Grandma used to have to feed threshers or large families, or it was hog killing time on the farm. But a fresh leg of pork is a wonderful cut for a large family gathering or for a good-sized group of guests. So I thought we would show you how to go about carving one. It's very like carving the leg of any other beast, but there are a few little tricks. First thing you want to do, because it's such a big slice and you want to carve it into slabs, really, not thin slices like you would a country ham. You want to carve it into thin steaks almost. So take off this little triangular shaped muscle here, cut that off, and set that aside. That gives you a good flat surface so that you can set the ham up on that flat surface. And now you can make a wedge back here, take out a wedge of that down toward the hock where it's a little bit fatty anyway. And then you can slice slices as thick or as thin as you like and cut down to the bone. You can do 2 or 3 slices at a time, or as many as you need, really. And then loosen the slices by cutting along next to the bone and transfer those slices carefully to your serving platter. Arrange those on a serving platter and serve them up with oh, whatever your family likes. In this case, some sweet potatoes and a pilaf. You could use grits or whatever kind, or mashed potatoes and gravy goes wonderfully well with this. We started this segment talking about how to carve a country ham. I thought we'd end by talking about city hams. Now, city hams come in a variety of different sizes and shapes, but usually they're molded into something that's round or loaf shape, such as this. There's really no trick to carving them. It's as simple as slicing a loaf of bread. But it's important, as it is so often the case with hams and with so many other things, to slice it very, very thin. There's a little trick I thought I'd pass along for how to get a good thin slice of what I call city hams, these boneless hams. Now, slicing any meat along a big surface like this, it's difficult to keep a nice uniform slice. Sometimes it's just a little more difficult. It's easier if you cut the ham in half first this way, just right down through the center of it, and then set this piece aside. Now you've got a good, firm, flat surface that stays where it wants to be, and you can slice down and get nice, uniform, thin slices of ham. City ham, which is, these are really a very nice ham for sandwiches. They don't have quite as much character, as far as I'm concerned, as a good old country ham, but they do make a very nice sandwich. A few slices like that on a platter, and you have the makings of a pretty good sandwich. There you have it on carving pork. Ah, those look fantastic. We are all, it seems these days, eating more and more poultry of all kinds, chickens and turkeys, and there's several reasons for it. One is for the perceived health benefits, I guess, but one of the main reasons, I think, is that because poultry is pretty good buy. Chickens are often downright cheap, so we eat a lot of them. And there are lots of different ways of carving poultry, and we're going to talk about a lot of those in this segment. Chickens can be carved very like turkey can be carved, and ducks are not a whole lot different to carve than a goose. So we'll talk about all of those, and we'll do each one a little bit differently. If you were doing chickens, a great big roasting chicken, you would carve it very like a turkey. If you have small broilers, you could carve it, just cut it in quarters and serve each guest a quarter. We'll show you how to do that when we talk about rock Cornish game hens, which we're also going to do. So these chickens, I thought we would do in the more traditional way, separating the legs and the thighs and the breast for individual servings. To do that, just hold the bird firmly with a fork. You can do this with your fingers if you're in the backyard, but we'll do it with the fork, the more traditional way that you would do it if you were doing it at the dining room table. Take off a wing, just down to the joint and through the wing. Take off the thigh by just cutting through the loose skin, bending the leg back and cutting through the thigh. Set that aside. Now turn the bird. Do exactly the same thing on the other side. Put the fork in, take off the leg, just bend it down, expose the joint, cut through the joint. Do exactly the same thing on the wing, down to the... Now, the breast, there's a breastbone here. If you'll just cut along the ridge of that breastbone on both sides and really just kind of push the meat just falls away from the bone. Do that on the other side, along the ridge of the breastbone, until you can push the meat back, and you have, for all intents and purposes, carved chicken. Set that aside, save the bone for the stock pot. Arrange the pieces nicely on your trencher here, your carving platter, and present it to your guests. Carving ducks and geese and all waterfowl, for that matter, sometimes causes carvers a bit of complication because the joints seem to be in the wrong place. I guess that's why ducks and geese walk kind of funny. But there are some allowances for that. So when you carve ducks, you can do some things that you wouldn't normally do carving a chicken. Let's show you what I mean. To carve a duck, just take plant your fork and then cut down between the leg and the body here through that loose skin until you can push back on the leg and pop the joint. Now, it might help because the joint, as I said, is farther back on the back. And it's allowable in this case to take a second fork, tilt the duck forward, and bend back on that until you can really, till you see that joint pop out at you. Then put your fork down and cut through the joint. Now, if you tried to find that without lifting the duck up, you would be really, you'd have a lot of trouble. So just lift it up and till you can find the joint. Now, cut the leg from the thigh. Every bird marks the spot. A lot of people have a hard time finding the spot, but if you just look, there's a little white piece of cartilage there. That's the joint. So just cut through the joint, and there you've got a nice piece of thigh and a nice piece of leg. Set those aside. Turn the duck around now, and we'll carve the breast. Again, plant your fork firmly, and cut down along the ridge of that breastbone, and down around the wing joint, or where the wing joint, where you think the wing joint should be, because as I say, they're not always there. And then when you can loosen the meat on the breast, again, put your knife down and take that second fork, pull on the meat until you can loosen that wing joint and find that, and then you can cut down through that wing joint, take off this half of the breast. Set that aside. Now, if you want, you can take that wing off altogether. Just cut through the breast like so. There you have a piece of bony wing, which I love to chew on, and a nice piece of duck breast. Do exactly the same on the other side. Serve your guests a piece of the leg, perhaps a piece of the breast. Add some snow peas with mandarin oranges and some wild rice. You have a beautiful duck dinner. There are a variety of wonderful game birds available to us and a variety of different ways of carving them. We have here pheasants and some game hens. You can carve partridge and chucker and even quail if they need carving in essentially the same way. There are several different kinds. We can carve a pheasant, for example, very like we carve the chicken, but here's another way you can do it. First, cut down between the leg and the thigh, that loose skin, just as you did on the chicken, so that you can push back on that thigh to reveal the joint, and then cut through the joint. Set that over here. Now, cut along the breastbone, on one side of the breastbone, and down to the wing joint. Cut through the wing joint and set that aside. Do exactly the same thing to the other side, and then serve each of your guests a piece of the breast with the wing attached and a piece of leg and thigh. And now for these little guys. Actually, it can be partridge or dove or any small bird that you don't want to really carve. You want to just kind of cut it in half and into serving-sized pieces. Turn the bird up so that you have the back facing the carver. Hold the bird with your fork, and then make one cut down the back so that you can open the bird open and cut alongside the breastbone so that you can cut it in half. And each of your guests then gets a half a bird. Another way with small birds is to do it like this. Cut down through the back and separate, take off that side of the leg and thigh. Do exactly the same thing on the other side. And then serve your guests the breast piece intact with the legs and thighs rearranged where they came off. So you can serve it like that. As you can see, there are all kinds of ways to carve fowl. One carving task that has over the years remained tradition in this country is the carving of the holiday bird, the turkey at Thanksgiving or Christmas or for the holiday season. A lot of you probably have trouble with carving the holiday bird. I know I have had trouble. But there are a few tips I'd like to pass along to you that might make your carving tasks with the holiday turkey a whole lot easier. So let's carve this thing. First thing to do is take, again, as with most birds, slice down again between that skin, between the leg and the thigh and the breast to loosen that, and push back on the leg so that you can separate that off and set it off to the side. Now, when carving a turkey, it's a good idea to have a little cutting board or another plate at least so that you can separate the leg from the thigh and then carve the thigh meat. I usually save the leg meat and somebody wants to chew on that, so that gets set aside and served separately. But the thigh meat, the dark meat, can get carved and then set aside. Now to the breast, and here is where the trick comes in. Don't bother taking off the whole wing. What I usually do is just separate the first two joints and lift that off, leaving the third joint, the larger joint of the wing, for the last. And that makes it easy to get to the breast. Now, to make a solid here, and this is the most important part, make a base cut deep into the breast, all the way down to the bone, right at the top of that wing bone there. Now, once that's done, it's a simple task to just slice down to that base cut, and you can slice off slices of breast just as simply as the master carver that you now have become. Carving the holiday bird, one of the tasks that we all do, and now we can do it well. As we said in the beginning, the art of carving may never attain the glory and spectacle of days gone by when our ancestors dined in grand halls like this. But hopefully this video will help restore the art of carving to its proper place among the culinary arts. At very least, I hope that it makes carving a Thanksgiving turkey a whole lot easier. Thank you for watching.